What is cracking, Hope Nation? It's your friendly neighborhood, Kevin Hines, and I couldn't be more excited today. Friends, family, colleagues, newcomers, today is a very, very special day. My great friend and pioneer in her industry is the phenomenal Kendall Alaimo is joining us on the Hinesights Podcast. Kendall is an award-winning international artist, advocate, a speaker, and a survivor of child trafficking. Her mission is to create artwork that fosters dialogue, to develop solutions for our world's most pressing issues, and to create pathways to sustainable freedom for survivors of modern-day slavery. Traditionally a painter, she also creates performance work, which includes her public speaking. She has addressed the United Nations General Assembly, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the United States military, Amazon headquarters, universities, global think tanks, and international organizations and intergovernmental organizations. Kendall's knowledge is expansive, and she speaks on a wide range of powerful topics, including human rights, human trafficking, child abuse prevention, mental health, resiliency, and mitigating trauma's impact in corporate settings. Kendall is a graduate of the School of Art Institute of Chicago. She also studied her craft in Japan and was selected to participate in the International Artists in Residence at the Centro Selva Center for Arts and Sciences in the Peruvian Amazon jungle. Her iconic painting, entitled Survivor Voices Leading the Way, has been exhibited in various international art events and is now housed in the United Nations headquarters in New York City. As an artist, Kendall is most known for iconic red seats that she sends around the globe. These are gifts, and Kendall embeds them into her paintings. She is the creator of the hashtag Seats4Survivors campaign, which calls for pathways to full social inclusion for survivors of modern-day slavery in need of both seat and sustainable freedom. She is a former advisor council member at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's OSCE, Office on Democratic Institutions and Human Rights to Combat Human Trafficking. Additionally, she has been an expert consultant for the OSCE on the nexus of modern-day slavery and disability. Her work has recently been featured on CNN International, BBC Radio, London and Amazon News. All in all, Kendall is a powerful storyteller, an advocate, and a dear friend. Please, viewers, listeners, and subscribers, give a warm, uproarious welcome to the Hinesights Podcast guest, the one and the only Kendall Alaimo. Kendall, how are you? How are you doing today? Thank you for joining the Hinesights Podcast.
I'm good. Well, that was quite an introduction, and thank you so very much for having me. It's a joy to be on your podcast and talk about mental health and suicide prevention and advocacy and what we both are doing to make the world and mental health accessible to many people. So what a pleasure. What an honor. Thank you so very much for having me.
Kendall, you're doing so much great work. So let's go and start from this spot right here. Can you tell us, so we get to know a little bit more about you? What do your mornings start like? How do you get ready in the morning before you go to your art studio? And what do your days look like as an activist?
Yeah, well, they definitely usually start out the same. I've been really active in my advocacy and policy work and often wake up first thing, which I shouldn't, but I open my phone and often kind of text or coordinate with international policymakers on how to get survivors like me of modern day slavery access to mental health care and resources. So a lot of policy briefings in the morning. For example, this morning, I just finished putting together a foreword for an international paper on how best to support people like me around the world in an international publication with an International Security Council. After that, I roll out of bed. I walk my 3 dogs. I've been into Peloton and doing a lot of Pilates lately, and then kind of ground myself, either get into my art studio. I usually have art studio days or advocacy days. And so art studio days, cups of coffee, put my music on repeat. I usually pick one song. I'm in the garage, full on sweatsuit and just painting and really immersing myself into the creative project. And then on my advocacy days, I usually have meetings with people at all hours around the world on how we create access to resources for mental health for survivors of child sexual abuse and those who have been trafficked globally. I'm certainly busy and really love what I do. And of course, one thing I really appreciate you is your ability to play and often fit that in with friends in my free time. So
good. I think that's really important, Kendall. I think adults forget that they have to play to re-energize the brain and reconfigure all the hard and tough days into something positive and wonderful and productive. So that's good. Play is important. Kendall, how did you get involved in human trafficking prevention advocacy? It's a pretty heavy topic, and I want to know why is it so important to you?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great question. And certainly the journey was quite long. And, there are days I have meetings with international organizations or in these spaces and I'm like, how did I get here? But I did, and I'm glad to be making a difference. It was certainly a long road. So in my childhood, I grew up in a home with child sexual abuse. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse by multiple family members. And of course, that really had an impact on my life and my physical and mental health. And I'm also a survivor of organized criminal abuse and child trafficking. So I was sold in the child sex trafficking industry and endured some really inhumane experiences. I look at it as my human rights were violated. I'm also a survivor of what would be considered under law torture. And so the things that I endured as a child had such a profound impact on my mental health. And then later in life, I was diagnosed with a very severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder that I live with today. And I always say the most important part of that sentence is I'm living with it, and I get to take my lived experience, knowledge of treatment and care and mental health access and go out into the world and help and mentor and consult on cases of really complex trauma. So after college, I ended up going into quite a bit of treatment, and I really saw that there was a huge gap in clinical care for people like me and started advocating for mental health access for children that go through child sexual abuse. This is a global public health crisis. We have 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys sexually abused in this country and around the world by the time they reach the age of 18. So you're talking about 25% of the global female population being sexually abused by the time they're 18. And so as I'm learning these statistics and I'm seeing the inaccess and I'm understanding, as you know, the higher levels of trauma one goes through, the higher levels of symptomatology, eating disorders, comorbid issues, obviously, leading to suicide if they don't get those resources. I became really passionate about it and had my own struggle accessing care for many years around the United States. And so got into mental health care advocacy. And then, of course, I'm a graduate of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I've got some paint on my desk right here. Love painting and really thought, well, what am I going to do? And I think as an artist, there's a social responsibility in being an artist. And what am I going to say with my art? And what am I going to do with my art? And how am I going to create impact on policy now? Because I think I went from mental health advocacy, and we can speak and speak and speak, but, like your film, The Net, you want to make, we need policy in a place, and almost like a net with policy to catch these survivors and ensure that there is access to resources. And so from that, I went on and got elected to be an advisor at OSCE. It's the world's largest international intergovernmental organization, and they're doing some incredible work. And, I say organization, but really dear friends. So got to advise there, and then got involved and introduced to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And really in my work, it went from mental health advocacy to policy work to really combating crime globally and really advising on, we have 50 million people around the world that are currently being trafficked in what we call modern day slavery. A lot of times when we think of slavery, we think of it in a historical context, but we actually have more people enslaved today than ever before in human history, and they're exiting sometimes without family, without clothes in their bag, right? Without access to education, without access to health care. And really, these people that exit these situations, are internally displaced people in their countries, and they're vulnerable to what experts in this field would consider re-exploitation, right? So they don't have access to mental health care. They need health care. And then people can come along and offer them access to health care or access to falsely promised family or access to a false job offer, and they keep getting re-trafficked. So really, my work went from mental health care to policy, to international security, to combating crime, and interweaving really my art through it. So that's quite a long story, but this is how I got where I am. So
Kendall, you've been through so much, but you're giving so much of yourself back to the world to prevent these kind of things from happening again, and to give people who have gone through them some hope, which is incredible. I'd like to ask you, and I am wondering, and I think this is a very important question for anybody who's been through trauma. What did your trauma teach you?
You know, actually, it taught me, it was interesting because we were saying before we were getting our tea ready, but I think it taught me a lot about people, honestly. I think when I was in compromising situations, when I was trafficked as a little girl, I mean, these were really life or death situations. And I have to think, gosh, how did I survive that? Whether it was my mind shutting down or dissociation. But one of the things my trauma taught me too is a lot of times people will say, Kendall, you have really EQ, or you're really good with working with people. But I think when you're in that much danger over and over again in your childhood, you learn to read people's faces, right? And read those micro expressions. And I think on some level, looking at my traffickers or being in compromising situations where my life depended on those micro expressions in a way, I think the trauma taught me how to read people and how to relate to people and how to sense emotions of people. And I think in the span of my work, I did my own healing and integrated quite a bit of my own trauma. I'm still on it. It's definitely a journey, as you know, but one thing this space really taught me is, whether it's working on my own trauma or interviewing people that have gone through all kinds of trauma all over the world that I've consulted on and learned about, is I think humans have such a difficult time facing trauma. And I often say, we often turn from trauma, right? We can't really turn towards it so easily. Like in your work, you often talk about destigmatizing mental health, but why are we turning from trauma, right? And I feel like what happens is, Kevin, if you said this happened to Kendall, that means it could happen to me. And I think if it happens to another human being and you're a human being and you identify that with being a human, that means what happened to Kendall could happen to me. And that's really threatening. And so we kind of psychologically turn from trauma. And I think we really need the courage to kind of turn towards it. So in this space, I've learned so much. But another thing I just wanted to say really quick, and I'm getting kind of chatty, is this week I was kind of walking my dogs. It's like, okay, I'm going to get on Kevin's podcast, and I've got my earbuds in, and what do I really want to say? And my first thought was this: well, we really need to ensure there's less trauma in the world, because when there's less trauma and less traumatized people, well, there's less suffering and there's less suicides. But then something occurred to me on my walk. I thought, actually, we also need, in a way, traumatized people in the world, because traumatized people have the innate and unique ability to be desensitized to these dialogues and be like me and you and be brave and courageous to turn towards those that need to be seen in their narrative. So I think we do need to mitigate trauma, but I think the lived experience experts that have gone through trauma are very, very needed in the world.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I will be honest with you, I've wanted to have you on the podcast for a very long time. Just certain things kept getting in the way. And this episode is very important to me, to get out your message and the larger trafficking prevention message to the world. Because as you said, 25% of young girls are going through this in our country, and that blows my mind. That's a quarter. That's horrifying. And I would like you to dive a little deeper into, if you don't mind, how truly common is child trafficking for the people that don't understand and maybe need to get involved and act and do something good for this cause. How common is it? Why should they get involved?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's such an honor. And, I consider this work, it's not a choice, and it just means so much to me to do. And thank you so much for these important questions. So unfortunately, and you have to look at the root causes, right? When we have problems, we have to look at the root causes. And so we're seeing links between child sexual abuse exposure and then later trafficking. We're seeing a lot of cases, very unfortunately, of familiar trafficking, where parents will traffic their children. This doesn't just happen overseas. This happens right here. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. So this is very unfortunately prevalent. This is a $150 billion criminal enterprise every single year. And so these traffickers are making quite a bit of money off of monetizing the childhoods and traumatizing these incredible children that need to be protected. But unfortunately, when we're talking about 1 in 4 girls being sexually abused by the time they're 18 or 1 in 6 boys, those numbers are linked to trafficking. And especially too, when you think of like psychological conditioning, if a child can't say no to a parent, for example, or an aunt or an uncle, and they're conditioned not to say no, well, then they're not going to say no to the next person, right? And so they're primed and already pre-traumatized and have core beliefs about themselves that they just have to be compliant in a sense. But this is very common. This is happening in this country. And, I didn't know if I was going to touch on this, but, with the pornography industry fueling it more and more and more, these are conversations we need to destigmatize and break down, but they are happening in towns all over the United States and all over the world. And there are signs, you can pick up in elementary schools or behavioral signs, and there are trainings people can go to. Safe House Project doesn't know I'm going to say this. They're a wonderful organization. They certainly didn't ask me to pitch today or anything like that, but if somebody wants to get involved and do something good, I really believe Safe House Project is an organization. They're doing incredible work, and what they do is they raise funds to scale and support housing around the United States for when children or adults that have been trafficked don't have a place to go and they're brave enough to exit. They have a home to go to. So that's an incredible organization. I think going through prevention education is another thing, and I think the first step is just having the conversation, sitting calm in your body and being brave enough to know these things happen in the world and we can take action and they don't need to keep happening. So
what would you say, and this I think is an important conversation to have, what do you think are the unique, from experience and from what you've seen in other folks, what are the unique mental challenges for survivors of human trafficking?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they have a unique pathology. And I will say, I think about identity a lot in my life and in my work and in my research and trauma, but I really believe we're all a product of the narrative we go through, right? And so I think our clinical symptomatology is a reflection of that narrative. So I wouldn't say all survivors have this or all survivors exhibit this. From what I've seen broadly, or maybe in my own experiences, we see a lot of survivors that continue to have comorbid symptoms, right? So they might show up with eating disorders. And one thing I wanted to touch on that is, in my life, in my childhood, this is vulnerable, but I think there's beauty in that. And I'm certainly resilient. Food was kept from me. I wasn't allowed to eat at certain times. I was also given food that had drugs in it. So my relationship with food growing up obviously was traumatic. And unfortunately, a lot of these cases, children will be given oral drugs or intravenous drugs or have food kept from them to condition them to be compliant. So that was my story. And so in my recovery, I dealt with eating disorders and bulimia, went through a lot of care for that. I'm here. But yeah, so I think in terms of trauma, oftentimes there's eating disorders with it. But I think for survivors of human trafficking or child trafficking, when they go into eating disorder care, it can be all kinds of complicated relationships with food. Is this food safe? Is it not safe? Am I allowed to eat now? Am I not allowed to eat? And so that's a unique kind of symptom too. And the other thing I will say is, when you're talking about the unique pathology of survivors and something that's so important for me, and especially as I'm talking to Amazon or, a corporation on why you need to hire survivors and create a trauma-informed pathways, obviously they have a baseline of complex PTSD or dissociative disorders or comorbid addiction, but, very specific fears, right? When you're talking about slavery, you're talking about being a survivor of child trafficking, I was forced to work, right? I didn't get paid for it. I was told what to do and I was compliant, and that's how I survived. But this idea that work itself becomes a phobia, or this idea that work can be avoided, any reminder of the trauma. And so what we're seeing in this population is survivors of forced and abusive, inhumane work, exiting without employment, and then having fears of work, or they go into work or they'll call out because there's certain dynamics that don't let them keep employment because they end up having flashbacks of the abusive work that they were forced to do while they're in a work setting. So that's also a unique kind of manifestation of these lived experience. So those are a few things that I wanted to touch on.
Fascinating, and I did not know or understand that aspect of it, so I really appreciate that articulation. A really important question, I think, and something people, I think, watching, listening, and subscribing need to understand. How are traffickers driving suicide rates?
Yeah.
It's an important question, and I think people need to get it.
Yeah. So this is for anybody listening, just, please relax your body. If this is getting too much, it's interesting. I always feel like I have a juxtaposition. I like dance around the kitchen with my dog and make colorful art. And then I deal with really hard things and true things and, combating crime in a sense. But we are seeing internationally and globally, we're looking at how these criminal groups operate. They are torturing some of these victims and instructing them not to tell. And then if they tell, to commit suicide before they tell, or sometimes there are situations where someone can be really badly hurt in front of them or killed. This is something that happened in my life. I witnessed somebody very badly hurt in front of me. But these survivors can be instructed to suicide or instructed not to tell, and they can be instructed on steps to complete and instructed on how to commit suicide if you ever remember, or how to commit suicide or the steps you have to take to commit suicide if you were ever to report, or a threat that they'll hurt somebody else if you ever disclose. And I think for me, I had repressed my trauma for so long, and as it came up, I had all of these thoughts and feelings coming up and not realizing that my traffickers had told me to commit suicide before I ever said anything. And I think there's so much, we're talking about in freedom, but there's so much freedom in having this podcast right now and doing the work that I do, but I'm free from that conditioning in a sense. And so it's really unfortunate, and it's just a terrible thing that traffickers are doing in the context of promoting people to suicide. And it's such a dehumanizing crime to go through. I wasn't allowed to use my own name. But to stand here today alive after a lot of care and a lot of advocacy and say, my name's Kendall Alaimo and I'm here is nothing short of a miracle. And I just want to make that path shorter for other people. So
making the path shorter for other people.
You're talking again about lack of economic resources. You're talking about not having a history of employment, so they might not, qualify for disability benefits. I will say step one, again, Safe House Project is doing an incredible job. Step one, they need a roof over their head. They need somewhere to go. They need somewhere that's safe, from their traffickers. They need access to mental health care. And then from there, they also need sometimes access to laptops. There was a safe house that flooded a few years ago that I made sure they got a computer there, right? So all kinds of support, housing, medical, clothing, like sometimes they don't even have clothing, access to tablets, computers, so that they might be able to take an online course from the safe house, and access to education. Unfortunately, we have also cases of survivors that have been indebted by their traffickers or indebted by their medical care, and then they can't go on to get a university degree. And that's just a great injustice, to be sold against your will and then indebted by the people that monetize you, and they can't move forward. They can't go to university. They can't obtain their own economic equity after being monetized in such a traumatic way. So access to university, and honestly, access to trauma-informed and disability accessible careers, not jobs at corporations. So just really the net is huge for as far as resources for these internally displaced people to be reintegrated into society again in freedom.
What policies do we need to see in place that maybe even something you're working on to get better access for survivors?
Yeah, well, I will start with, in a dream world, and, there's always like intersections, right? And it's like sometimes when you have a problem, you look at another problem that was solved, or similar problems or parallels in certain social challenges. And a lot of times too, and I know you've spoken at the military and I have too, but, I thank you everybody who has served, but veterans with PTSD really need care too. What's working for them and what can work for on a governmental and federal level, what's working for them, which could always be improved, but how could we apply those systems or those modalities to survivors with PTSD? I mean, honestly, in a dream world, I'd love to see survivors having access to healthcare policies without an income gap limit, so they can try to work. And if they have a phobia of work, they can still stay on it while they're getting care for that phobia. Access to housing for more than 12 months. A lot of these programs will say you can live here for 12 months, but then you're kind of on your own, or you have to go, or the safe houses can lose funding, and then they're back on the streets again before they have integrated their trauma and healed and learned how to manage PTSD. So I'd say healthcare plans that cover and also multiple times a week, right? I will tell you, this is very vulnerable. And, it's just like, you've done this, this, and this. Well, I've done it because I've also done a lot of work. There are times it's like 2 or 3 days a week in therapy for me to get through this. And so we need insurance policies to not just cover 1 hour, sometimes 2 hour sessions, and sometimes for 2 or 3 times a week and for years. And so they need access to this coverage. They need access to long-term housing. And so, those are just huge barriers that I'd like to see. I just made a keynote in the Human Dimension Conference in Poland a couple of months ago. And I said, honestly, I'd love to see the World Health Organization addressing these barriers and really seeing the world come together on a global level and recognizing the unique pathology of survivors, because I think that can drive funding or dialogue or policy on getting this.
Okay, Kendall, this is the part where we learn about the artist side of Kendall. When did you start creating art, and how has it been such a healing journey?
It's interesting. Yeah. So I can't even recall when ever since I was a little girl, I've always drawn, colored, loved color. I feel really excited when I see color patterns. So it's definitely something that's always stimulated me visually. I've always created ever since I was a little girl. It's funny, I have memory. I think I was like 4 or 5, and I think a teacher came up to me and I said, Kendall, how did you draw that? And I said, well, I just traced over my imagination, of course, and I think I've kept tracing over my imagination in a sense, whether it's a painting I want to create or an advocacy speech I want to give or sending red seats around the world. But art is such a big part of my identity. And I think it's also allowed me to survive in a sense. I think art was such a great modality for me, especially, it's interesting. I spoke to Dr. Gamer Batate's son, Daniel, a few days ago about how, survivors often are told not to tell in such a threatening way, and the trauma in the hardship they have with speaking words. And so art is a way to tell your story without actually speaking the words. And I think art therapy is just a great modality for any trauma. And it certainly helps me both process my real narrative, but also create work to scale impact in the world. And, one thing I really try to accomplish with my art is, especially these are global issues. This isn't just here in Chicago or in the United States. And what is my responsibility as an artist, right? And I think creating art is a visual language, right? It doesn't have a linguistic barrier. People around the world can see it. And I think there's this juxtaposition with my art where it's really bright, it's really colorful, but it often addresses really difficult things. And I think that gives people around the world the ability to have the courage to turn towards something bright and then lean into the darker narrative. And I love this idea of using my art to engage people in solutions. So.
Wow, incredible. And what responsibilities do you feel artists have to giving back to their community?
Yeah, well, I don't want to burden any artists listening here. You're all responsible. No, I think that's with any skill set, right? I think, you have an amazing ability to speak and advocate, and you're using it to prevent suicide, right? Or a doctor has an ability to do heart surgery, right? So I think I think it's not just limited to artists. I think if you have a skill set, use it for good, scale it for good. And I think for me, to go through what I went through as a young child, and to go through a really challenging mental health system, and to go through really unimaginable adversity and not use my knowledge to fill the gaps in policy with my art would be doing a disservice to my life story, to my inner child, to my inner childhood, but the childhoods of many people around the world. Yes, it's a responsibility to me, I guess.
Beautifully said. What is your biggest dream as an artist?
Oh my gosh. Can I have my painting in the Louvre?
Yeah, let's get your painting in the Louvre.
No. Yeah. Well, I would love that. We definitely need to document modern day slavery. It's going to be, it's history today. I don't think there's some museum I want my art specifically. I think, it's interesting. I think sometimes I wake up in the morning, and I don't know if this is how you feel as an advocate, but my head's on the pillow and I'm like, how am I going to make a difference today? Or, I'm really appreciative. It's great to win awards. I feel honored by that, but really my head's on that pillow and I want to make an impact in one person's life. And how am I going to do that? Right. And so I just want my art to foster these dialogues and implement policy that works to ensure people all over the world have the human right of freedom, have healthy and safe childhoods, and have access to mental health care, and to feel seen and belong and be free. That's all. So
Belong and be free. Incredible words by Kendall. Wow. Okay. Transition here for a bit on the art, but on the advocacy side as well. What projects are you currently working on? And can you tell us a bit more about the Red Chair Project and how people can get involved?
yeah, so right now I am working on a painting about the red chairs in a corporate setting, the importance of chairs being in a corporate setting. So like thinking about imagery of that as I paint. And then the red chairs is a really cool project that kind of came about. I was sitting in my house years ago and I had a folding chair sitting in my house, and I thought, okay, I'm an artist. There's a folding chair. Like, what can I do with this? And I thought about these internally displaced people, or my own challenges having a seat in certain places. And what was I going to do with this seat? And I'm an artist and I'm like, seat, social inclusion. And it was interesting. I really believe, I think Mel Robbins was saying something about manifesting the other day on Instagram. I'm scrolling. I'm like, yeah, manifest, Mel. Yeah. So I like that. I do that. That's a good thing. So it's interesting. I had taken the chair to the edge of the lake and I had photographed it, and I thought it was such a powerful image to me. And I was like standing there. This was like 3 years ago. I was like, one day I'm going to like, this chair is going to go across the ocean. I don't know if I'm, I got a feeling this is a great image. And then sure enough, like 3 years later, the United Nations World Day on Trafficking was coming. And I thought, can I do a performative piece with these chairs in honor of United Nations recognized World Day Against Trafficking? And I called my friend and I said, do you think we can send red chairs around the world in different countries, like in the next, like, I don't know, like 2 weeks? And they're like, Kendall, that's like 2 weeks. Like, you're talking countries all over the world. You're talking moving furniture, like around the world in 2 weeks. I know you're pretty ambitious, but like, I don't know if I can help you on this one. And I was walking my dog and I was really discouraged. And like, here comes the depression. And it's like, no, I'm going to do it, and figured out a way to send red seats all over the world, to India, the Congo, Scotland. And really this project was performative, and it was really about seats for survivors at academic institutions around the world, and in healthcare, access to jobs. And so really for me, the red seat, I show up to events with it on occasion. I gift them to people doing really good work in the human trafficking space. And the red seat to me as an artist symbolizes social inclusion, having a seat and saving a seat for a survivor in need of those resources we talked about earlier. And then of course I ordered them off Amazon and was invited to go speak there. And somebody in the audience said, they're like, oh, Kendall, you really are testing the return policy. And I was like, in the name of freedom, I'll test it. So they own some of my artwork. And so it's been nice. So that's what the red seat represents. I embed them in paintings. I ship them places. I show up with them. I'd love to continue to gift them to corporations and go in and train as a consultant on trauma-informed training with the red seat. So it's been fun. I think this is such a difficult topic and a challenging topic, but I often say the child within me survived, and I love the playfulness of just showing up with a seat or putting a seat in a different environment. So it's been quite fun.
I think, Kendall, you've really found a way to humanize something that is so dehumanizing, which is fascinating and really important and really powerful and really meaningful, really meaningful. Kendall, how important is, you mentioned Mel Robbins scrolling through the Instagram feed. I mean, everything she says is like amazing and gospel. That woman is a phenom, but just like you are. How important is manifestation for you, and what does manifesting mean to you?
Yeah, no, that's really great. And I love Mel Robbins, especially her ones where she's like, you have to get out of bed in 5 seconds. I was like, I really do. Like, I have to get out of bed in 5 seconds. It's a must. Like, no, I was going to hit snooze. No, I think it's definitely something that's important, right? Like if you sit around and you say, I can't do this, or I can't envision this, or you don't allow yourself the capacity to creatively envision who you want to become or what you want to create, the space for doing that is pretty limited. I think for me, and there's research, right? The more traumatized an individual is, the more creative they are. I'm certainly have had a lot of trauma in my life, and I'm certainly on this scale of creativity. But for me as an artist, I can be in the kitchen with my partner or, walking my dog, and I just like, I'm going to be here, and I'm going to reveal a big painting here, and then I'm going to send a red chair here, and, I'm going to make this happen. And then I tell myself, I'm like, am I crazy? And I stop myself. I was like, no, like you saw it in your mind, go make it happen. And I think there's it's about creating based off of that vision and believing that it can come into fruition. So I think manifesting as far as my advocacy and my artistic practice is really quite a part of it. And I'd often say too, sometimes people are like, how'd you get here? How'd you get here? I often say too is, never wait for an opportunity. Go out there and create it, right? Invite yourself to the party, create the opportunities and create the experiences and invite yourself in community and add value. So yeah, that's just how I practice personally. And it's been fun. So
take the opportunity, add value where you can every time you can. I think that's really crucial. I consider myself a bit of an artist too. I sketched my entire life as a kid, stopped after my third psych ward stay because I lost that part of me. But I turned it into something else. Got a little older, wrote a couple books. Here, you got one right here. But just because the written word is so powerful, and I hope we someday get to hear the book from Kendall, because I think that would change everyone. I mean this from my heart. I think it would change everyone who reads its lives for the better in a huge way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think someday that would be incredible to see. But Kendall, what brings you today the most amount of joy?
Honestly, just being in community. It's interesting. It's like I was so hurt by people and I was so violated in relationship and by people, but I love people. Honestly, going to the grocery store for a gallon of milk and checking out and saying hello to somebody at the grocery store, meeting somebody new. I love networking. I love seeing people in their authenticity. I love building relationship. I just love being in social structure and in friendship. I just love the thing that brings me most joy is connection.
Connection. I think that's crucial. And, we lost that during COVID, a little bit after COVID, as COVID still goes on in its own way. I think people, scientifically speaking, we all need connection, love, and care. Even hugs are very important. Kendall, final question. And I think this is probably the most important question. What would you say as someone who's been there, gone through it, come out on the other side, and is giving back so much to the world? What do you say to the young girl who is maybe being trafficked right now, or she's been trafficked, and she desperately wants to find light at the end of the tunnel, and she desperately wants to find hope, healing, and recovery from her pain? What are the words you would say to her in this moment right now?
3 words. I would kneel down to that little girl and I would say 3 words. I would say, I believe you. And I think I would tell them I believe them. And when you're believed, there's something that happens. When you're believed about your narrative, you become real. And when you're real, you can live. And when you can live, you can dream. And I would say if there's anybody suffering from PTSD, having sleepless nights, flashbacks, frustrations with access to care, just keep going. Find a peer group, somebody that also lives with it. Just don't give up, because I think adversity and challenges birth incredible things I wouldn't have been able to do without it. And there's a lesson in what you're living, and you're going to go out into the world and you're going to teach it.
Wow. Kendall, I think we'll leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, colleagues, everybody listening, viewing, and subscribing, this has been another episode of the Hinesights Podcast with the wonderful Kendall Alaimo. Please share this episode with as many people as you can find that might be going through pain, because pain is universal, and this will relate to them. Friends, whatever you do, fight to be here tomorrow and every single day after that. Take care and be well. See you.